Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming to our talk today. My name is Ben Porter. I'm the consulting director at Newzoo, and today we'll talk about the state of the PC and console gaming industry in 2024. To begin with, I'll give a brief overview of some of the products that Newzoo provides. And the purpose of this is to contextualize where the data is coming from that you'll see throughout the rest of this presentation. So to begin with, we have roughly three pillars that we of data that we offer, which roughly fall into know the games, know the gamers, and know the games market. When we're talking about know the games, we have a product called the Game Performance Monitor, and this has title level KPIs such as for engagement and revenue, such as MAU, ARPU, total revenue, so on and so forth. For gamer research, we have the Global Gamer Study, which has audience demographics and psychographics. So who are the people that play these games and what are their motivations to play? What do their gaming behaviors look like? As well as a game health tracker, which tracks the game hype cycle and the intent to purchase, intent to play. And then finally, we have Know the Games Market, where we have the Games Market Report and forecasts. And in this product, we size the games market by the total number of players, payers, and revenue on a global level, regional level, and at a market level. We'll be drawing on bits of information from all three of these throughout this presentation, but mostly we'll be looking at the Games Performance Monitor, where again we have that title level engagement data, as well as some high level analysis from the Games Market Report and forecasts. Finally, at the bottom, of course, we have some consulting and custom research. That's the box that I live in. But we'll get right into it. So in April, we launched the PC and console report, and this is a vertical slice of that. At the end of this presentation, you'll see a QR code, which will take you to a page where you can download the PC and console report for free. And there you'll have access to all of the information that we're showing on these slides. And furthermore, there will actually be more sections. So this is a bit of a vertical slice of some of the key topics and some of the key talking points from that presentation. So what are we going to look at today? Well, first of all, we're going to look at the PC and console market outlook. Then we're going to look at some behavioral changes as they pertain to playtime hours. And then finally, we're going to look at some areas of opportunity and some breakout hits. So jumping right into it with the PC and console market outlook. So as I mentioned, one of the lenses that we view the games industry through is the lens of the number of players in partaking in the whole industry. And what we define as a player is anybody who has played on a PC or a console in the last six months, any game on any of these systems. And we're also looking cross-generational. So it's okay if it's a PS4, PS5, 3, or a PS5. That all counts as, for example, a console player. So what have we noticed? Well, in 2018 through to 2021, both PC and console experienced a higher degree of player growth with 4% and 9% compound annual growth rates, respectively. Now, this flattened out from 2021 to 2023, which was the kind of peak of COVID into the post-COVID timeframe. And during that time, we had only about a 1% and just about a 4% compound annual growth rate for PC and console, respectively, which is about half for console and about a quarter for PC. Now, we expect that this trend will actually continue into the coming 3 years. So really, post-COVID growth has remained flat. There is still growth, but it is relatively flat for the next 3 years. And we don't really see anything on the horizon that's going to grow the pie for everybody. And what we mean by that is a new sort of disruptive innovation in terms of business model, content, or technology that's going to bring in a net new, 100 million, 200 million, 500 million players. So right now, it's a very sizable industry and a sizable player base, but the growth has slowed down a little bit. And I do receive questions, well, what was driving growth before? And of course, free-to-play business model is one of those growth factors. That was a very disruptive business model that had a big impact in terms of allowing more people to engage with gaming and therefore growing the overall gaming base for PC and console. Jumping over to the revenue side of things. So again, one of the other lenses that we view the games market through is the lens of revenue. And to start with, I will define revenue in the context of Newzoo before we get into the actual numbers. When we're speaking about revenue, typically we're speaking about player spend on or in games. So that includes any kind of spend that is the purchase of a title, the purchase of something within a title, the purchase of a battle pass or DLC, or even a multi-game subscription like Game Pass. And that but we exclude anything like hardware, peripherals, or B2B revenue like ad revenue or ad spend. So really, we're hyper-focused on in-game spending or spending on game and in-game by players. So with that said, from 2015 to 2021, Newzoo's been tracking the market for this period of time and sizing it, and we estimate that the games industry has grown by about 50%. So from $62 billion globally to $94 billion globally in 2021. Now, again, that's the peak of COVID, which had all eyes on gaming. And for the several years after that, up to 2023, there was a flattening in overall revenue. Now, this was in part due to players that had entered during and around COVID that were now starting to spend a little bit less time and therefore a little bit less money engaging with games. But there's other reasons for this as well. Perhaps, the rise of social media, players spending time in other places and therefore money in other places. Now, when we look to the future, we still do anticipate that there will be growth. So we've estimated a 2.7% compound annual growth rate from 2023 to 2026. Now, what's driving this? We think that that console will be the main driver for this growth, and we believe that there's three reasons for this. First, console in this time frame will be entering into the more mature phase of the console generation. So we're already looking at mid-cycle hardware refreshes, and now we'll be moving into the phase where we're hitting peak install base for this console generation. Next, when you get to the more mature phase of console generation, you get the largest library of next-gen content available, which again coincides with more next-gen content available, and more install base usually coincides with higher degree of spending on games and in games. And then finally, we'll have a shift of household entertainment budget towards software. So at the beginning of a console generation, household entertainment budget can be allocated to hardware, peripherals, maybe upgrading TVs, etc. Again, that revenue is not captured in our forecast because we're looking at gaming revenue only. But towards the tail end of a console generation, when you have the peak install base and you have the peak next-gen content available, that's when we see historically that there is a higher degree of spending on and in games. And so that's our expectation. Now, that doesn't mean that PC won't grow. It's just not anticipated to grow at the same rate that console will grow. So in summary, for our outlook on the PC and console market is that player growth is relatively flat, and revenue will grow mostly from the peak of the console generation. Moving on to the next section, we'll look at some changes in behavior for players over the past several years. And again, that pertains to playtime and hours. So to start with, we've seen that there's been a decrease of playtime hours, of average quarterly playtime hours from Q1 2021 to Q4 2023 of about 26%. So that's a pretty steep drop off. Now, to contextualize that, in Q1 2021, that was the peak of, or in and around the peak of COVID. So countries around the world were in various states of lockdown, and people had a lot of free time on their hands. They were looking for different forms of entertainment to engage with, and video games really outperformed during that period. And you can see already in Q2 and Q3, there's pretty steady drops in average quarterly playtime. Now, this trend actually continues through to the end of Q4 2023 and starts to flatten out, which looks promising. However, there are a few red flags that we would still point out and draw your attention to. First, Q4 2023 has a 0% rise or fall, but that contains Christmas. And typically what you would expect is holiday spending in Q4, and more importantly for this chart, the free time to spend on the games that you've just purchased. So a flat Q4 or flat holiday season does raise a little bit of a red flag. Now, secondly, what's not pictured here is that in January of 2024 compared to January of 2023, there was a 10% decrease in average quarterly playtime, which is quite a steep drop off. So it does look like there is potential for this trend to continue. Now, again, to contextualize it, this type of trend is also very slate driven. So if there's a weaker quarter or a weaker month within that quarter, it can, of course, drive down playtime, and that can be balanced out when there's stronger slate releases. Now, one other thing that's not pictured here is we did make some initial analyses on revenue per hour, and we did see that revenue per hour has risen over this time frame. And so what that indicates to us is that many of the hours that are associated with the playtime that has departed from gaming over the past several years was not associated with a high degree of spend. And so what that means is the people that are still playing games and that are still engaging with games within this chart, reflected within this chart, are likely a more core and higher spending portion of the audience. Now, one other question that we do get sometimes is where's this game time going? And again, we talked about COVID being one part of the story, but another part of the story is the rise of social media, and you can look at things like Reddit and Discord and TikTok and other spaces like this and see that, of course, they were big in 2020 and 2019, but they continue to grow over time. And gaming, when we look at it through the lens of time, it's always going to be competing against things that are not gaming. So this is our suspicion, and we have some research that we're launching soon that will hopefully help to confirm a little bit of where this game time is going. All right, moving on to the next part of the story. We also found that about 80% of playtime is captured by only 66 titles in 2023. And we took this and looked back at 2022 and 2021, and we found that this only fluctuated by a couple of titles, so not very much. And that tells us that not only is the industry relatively consolidated in terms of where playtime is going, but it has been for several years. So this is not a new phenomenon. This has already been the case in the last 2 years as well. All right, next we're going to look at how playtime is being spent in each of those years relative to the age of the titles that it is being spent on. So again, we're looking at 2021, 2022, and 2023. We then broke the playtime hours out into 3 categories, and that's time that was spent on titles that are less than 2 years old, time that was spent on titles that are 3 to 5 years old, and time that was spent in titles that are 6 years or older. And that's relative to the year that we're reporting on. So in 2023, a title that was released in 2022 or 2023 would count as an under 2-year-old title, or what we're dubbing a new game for all intents and purposes. And again, you'll notice that the x-axis here has changed from being hours to now being a percentage. So this is a relative breakdown of how that time is being spent. Okay, so the first trend that I would draw your attention to is the dark blue bar has grown quite significantly from 2021 to 2022 and again into 2023. That's the mature game time. And in 2023, this is peaking at over 60% of playtime for 2023 is spent on titles that are 6 years old or older. the big jump that you see from 2021 to 2022 is Fortnite maturing from a 3 to 5 year old game or a middle-aged game into a mature title or a 6-year and older game. Now, the second trend on this chart that I would point out is the light blue bar, which is the under 2-year-old bar, has grown quite significantly and peaks on 2023. Which again, this represents new games, and 2023 had a very rich release slate. So it makes sense that you would over-index on new title playtime. But that does beg the question then, if mature title playtime has been growing and new game playtime has been growing, where is the time coming from? And it's coming from the middle-aged game. So again, in 2021, to 2022, we see that this big drop is Fortnite maturing into the next category, but that continues in 2023. So it does show that there is a bit of a continuation of this trend. Now, there's two ways that we think about this. First, if you are a premium title, and by that I mean you monetize primarily through the upfront sale of your game, then this is really eating into your long tail of sales, because of course most premium titles are going to monetize the majority in the earlier months and years of post-launch. But if you're a live service game, this is a bit of a different story. Now, this gap or chasm that we see is what you need to jump across to move from being a new live service game to being a forever live service game, which we'll talk about what those are in future slides. Now, one other thing, while we're on the topic of middle-aged games, I thought I would point out what are the top middle-aged games in this chart. So we took the top 5 middle-aged games from 2023. And we found, so these are games that are 3 to 5 years old as of 2023. And we found that Valorant, Apex Legends, Genshin Impact, Cyberpunk 2077, and World of Warcraft Classic are the top 5 middle-aged games. Now, 4 of these are live service games, and 3 of them are free to play. Cyberpunk, of course, is here because they did a really wonderful job of revitalizing that title with the launch of Liberty City, but typically we would not expect to see a single-player premium title pop up here. But again, this is a bit of an exception. But for the others, you would expect to see live service titles, free to play and pay to play. The main takeaway here is that this 8% of overall playtime that these top 5 collectively add up to, it's quite likely that in a few years' time, they will maintain a large amount or much of the playtime hours that they are currently capturing, which means that there's a good chance, all else being equal, that 8% begins to migrate again to the mature game category, meaning that what we saw on the earlier chart of over 60% of time being spent in mature games could reasonably be 70% in a few years' time from now. Now, diving into the mature game category, we wanted to look, what are these mature games? I mentioned forever games or forever franchises earlier. And so again, we took a look at what are the top 5 titles that are 6 years or older as of 2023 and investigated how much playtime they add up to. And we found that collectively, the top 5 titles made up 27% of overall playtime for 2023. And those titles were Fortnite, Roblox, League of Legends, Minecraft, and Grand Theft Auto 5. Now, there's also a longer tail of titles that you would see if you were to continue to run this down that you would also recognize, such as, for example, Counter-Strike or Dota, and so on and so forth. But we've just limited on this slide to showing the top 5. But again, these games are titles that you would typically expect to see in the top 10 or absolutely the top 20 titles month over month in terms of playtime. So when we talked about 66 titles capturing the majority of playtime in an earlier slide, these are the titles that are capturing quite a bulk of time. And this makes it quite difficult to launch a new game in 2024 and beyond. Now, we'll dive into a little bit more detail on Fortnite and Roblox and see what's happening in those ecosystems in particular, because they are some of the highest netting games in terms of total hours and playtime. So in this slide, we've switched away from looking at hours, and we're now looking at MAU. And what we're looking at particularly is fluctuations or growth in MAU. And you can see this is for Roblox and for Fortnite. And you can see that in July, August, and September of 2023, both of these games were relatively flat for MAU growth. As of October, Roblox launched on PlayStation, and that increased the MAU by 54% month over month. Now, in November, Fortnite launched OG, and which was a return of the original map for people to play on. That had a huge influx of MAU, and it grew by 60% month over month. In December, Fortnite launched Lego Fortnite, Fortnite Festival, and Rocket Racing. It maintained the 60% growth from November and grew an additional 16% month over month in December off the back of those launches. So this is absolutely massive growth that's being driven by by Fortnite and Roblox. Now, what's interesting here is to look at the interplay between the two, because in October, when Roblox launched on PlayStation, Fortnite stayed relatively flat. And again, when Fortnite launched OG, Roblox dropped a little bit, but not massively, only about 12%, coming off of its 54% gain. And again, in December, with again, huge launches from Fortnite, Roblox only declined about 3%. So what does this tell us? Well, we did some searching, some analysis on other games that we have access to within the Game Performance Monitor. And effectively, you see a Fortnite-shaped hole in the MAU of the rest of the market. So Fortnite really did actually hoover in a lot of players from other places. In other words, the Roblox players and the decline in that MAU does not explain fully where the 60% and plus 16% came from for Fortnite. So the main takeaway here, again, is that if you are launching a game in 2024 and beyond, you absolutely are competing against a Fortnite and a Roblox. And again, even if you don't think that categorically your game falls into the same in the same part of the industry or genre or subgenre, keep in mind that these titles are launching more diverse experiences, in the case of Fortnite through their premium releases, but in both through their UGC element of their platform. So for UEFN in the case of Fortnite. And again, in the future, we expect that this will continue, particularly with Fortnite, as we've seen that they have, of course, a new partnership formed with Disney. And it's reasonable to believe that they're going to continue with these types of launches using different IP in the future. Okay, now we're going to jump back to playtime in 2023, the chart that we were looking at before. And we're looking now at new game playtime. So earlier we looked at middle-aged titles, then we looked at more mature titles. Now we're looking at the breakdown for new game playtime. So this is titles that are under 2 years old. And that made up 23% of overall playtime in 2023. But we wanted to break that down further and understand where's this time going. So first, we looked at annual release franchises. So these are titles where you would expect some kind of release every year. So a Call of Duty, EAFC, NBA 2K, Madden, and The Show. And there's a longer tail of annual franchises that we would expect every year as well, not shown here. Collectively, all of the annual release franchises made up 15% of overall playtime, and that's 60% of new game playtime. So the key takeaway here is that if you're launching a new game, it's very difficult to consider something like NBA 2K or Madden or The Show to be a part of your addressable hours or your addressable market when you're launching, because there's quite a few players that are looking for this specific experience, and maybe they will only buy a handful of games, and every year NBA 2K will be one of them. And so unless you're launching a direct competitor, NBA 3K, then it's quite difficult to assume that you can pry hours away from these types of experiences, because they're quite ingrained in players' lives. So that begs the question, well, what remains? And what we found remains is about 8% of total playtime. And that 8% is spent on titles that are not a part of an annual release or an annual franchise, but that doesn't mean they're not a part of a franchise. So in this case, the top 5 titles that we found in this category were Diablo 4, Hogwarts Legacy, Baldur's Gate, Elden Ring, and Starfield. And now collectively, these 5 titles accounted for about 3.5% of overall playtime in 2023. Now, when you look at these top 5 titles, some of them are new IP, and some of them are not. So in the case of Starfield, that's a new IP, but and Elden Ring as well. But actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, there are further explanations for why these games would be successful. So Starfield is a Bethesda game. Bethesda has a very long and storied history um, of creating great games for decades now. Elden Ring is from Software. Similarly, they've been making games, particularly their Dark Souls and Demon Souls games, since the early 2000s, and they go back even farther than that. Baldur's Gate 3, of course, it's an existing franchise, though it's been dormant for a period of time, but Larian has been making games for 20 years now or so. And again, this is sort of the culmination of many, many years of work. Diablo 4 being Blizzard, and of course, Hogwarts Legacy came from Avalanche, which prior to being a Warner Brothers studio working on this title, was a part of Disney working on the Disney Infinity line, which I believe was an over $1 billion line of business for Disney. So all of these studios have tasted success. So all of the top 5 studios, let's say, have sort of a storied history to them, and reasons to explain why they would have been so successful. That does bring us to the end of the second section, which is the gamers clocking in fewer playtime hours. So to summarize, overall playtime is down significantly from the peak in 2021. Older titles are capturing an increasing share of playtime hours. Everyone is competing with Fortnite and Roblox, and new title playtime is largely captured by annual franchises or titles that are coming out of very well-established studios. Now, not all is doom and gloom. So now we're going to switch pace a little bit and look at a little bit of learnings from other areas of opportunity or some other success stories over the past year. Okay, so we're keeping, in our first chart, we're keeping the same definition that we were looking at before in terms of what a new game is. So we're talking about a game that was released in the last 2 years. And now we're looking at the share of playtime as the share of playtime spent on new titles, but now it's broken down by the business model of the game itself. So what we saw is, first of all, that 90% of the new game playtime was spent on 48 titles. Now, of that, 73% of new game playtime in 2023 was spent on live service pay-to-play titles. So think of this like Diablo, but you can also think of EAFC. Both of these titles you purchase upfront, and then there's a live service component where they continue to monetize on the back end. 16% of overall new game playtime was spent on premium titles. Again, that's a title that monetizes predominantly with just an upfront purchase and less so on the back end, though there could be maybe DLC. And then finally, only about 1% of live service, 1% of the top playtime for 2023 was spent on live service free-to-play titles. And again, in this case, there's no barrier to entry. It's a free-to-play title. It monetizes purely through gaming engagement. Think of this like, well, the 3 titles that we had here were the Finals, Honkai Star Rail, and Marvel Snap. These were the 3 titles that made it into the top 90%. Now, the remaining 10% is spread across about 1,400 other titles. That doesn't mean that they were not successful. You can still be a very successful title within that 10%. It just means you did not make it into the top 90% of playtime. Now, we wanted to understand, what does this mean if you view this, instead of looking at it, the breakdown of new game playtime, but new game revenue? And so we now switch to looking at revenue specifically for new games. And we found some quite interesting shifts. First of all, live service pay-to-play titles shifted from 70-odd% down to being 59%. So they shrunk in terms of their overall share of the pie. Again, that was the games like Diablo, EAFC, NBA 2K, so on and so forth. Premium titles actually doubled. So think about Hogwarts Legacy, think about Elden Ring or Starfield. They moved from being 16% of playtime, of new game playtime, to being 32% of new game revenue in 2023. And free-to-play new game revenue actually dropped off entirely. So we didn't have any free-to-play new games that made it into the top 90%. And again, the remaining 10% is spread across 1,400 other titles. So one of the key takeaways here is that on PC and console, gamers are still very accustomed to paying for their games. And in terms of new titles, it appears that most of the new titles that have performed well, that were launched in 2022 or 2023, did have some kind of upfront pay-to-play component to it. Now, when we zoom out and we get rid of our new game definition, now we're looking at just player spend on games for 2023 as a whole. This includes new games as well as middle-aged and mature games. For PC and console, we see some similarities in how that revenue breaks down. We broke down that spend into premium, microtransaction, downloadable content, and subscription. Now, in this case, specifically, we're talking about subscriptions for a single game. Think Final Fantasy XIV or World of Warcraft. And what we found is that the majority of spend, over 56 or 57% on each of these two platforms, the majority of spend was premium. Microtransactions came in next, downloadable content came in after that, and subscriptions was the smallest component. But again, the devil is in the detail here, because spending on a specific game, because we're no longer breaking this down by business model, can be broken down into different buckets here. So if you were to buy NBA 2K, that would be a premium transaction and go in the premium bucket. But if you were to buy something within NBA 2K, that would be a microtransaction, and that would go in the microtransaction bucket. So again, the key takeaway here is that the majority of spend on PC and console still is in the realm of premium, but microtransactions are a big chunk and cannot be ignored. So this is something to keep in mind if you're launching a game into the future, at some point in the future, some of the patterns that we've seen in terms of which games have been successful, or which types of games. All right, next we're going to look at some breakout hits from 2023, and we're going to cheat a little bit and move into 2024 as well. We picked 7 titles here, so Baldur's Gate 3, BattleBit Remastered, Palworld, Lethal Company, The Finals, Ready or Not, and Helldivers 2. Why we picked these titles is because one thing they have in common is that their success is not necessarily explained by the IP that they are associated with. Of course, Baldur's Gate is the third in a now trilogy of games, but Baldur's Gate itself has been dormant for 20 years and doesn't fully explain its success. And of course, it is a part of the Dungeons and Dragons franchise, but that is not a guarantee of success either. In the case of Helldivers 2, that is a sequel, but Helldivers 1 was a very different scope and scale and reach ultimately, and therefore, again, does not fully explain the success of Helldivers 2. So what do we think are common success factors amongst these games? Well, first, these are all focused, highly polished, and very well executed games with strong core gameplay loops. And more importantly, they're borrowing from really well-established gameplay loops. And in many of these cases, they're moving into gaps that have been left behind or otherwise ignored by AAA games. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at BattleBit Remastered, it's backfilling for the Battlefield, which has moved on to be a live service hero shooter. And if you look at Ready or Not, it's backfilling for Rainbow Six, which again moved on to be a live service game with Siege. And even with Baldur's Gate 3, it's the modern form of what is effectively an isometric computer RPG, which has been largely left behind for the last 20 years by AAA publishers and developers, of course, with a few notable exceptions, one of them being Larian themselves. Now, point three is that all of these games had very strong developer and community support. And in every case, except for Helldivers 2, they had early access. Baldur's Gate 3, for example, was in early access for, I believe, 3 years. And what this means is that the developers are able to form a relationship with the strongest core of their community, incorporate their feedback, and again leads to a very polished game that that the community all is asking for and wants. So this developer community support is really valuable for informing your gameplay, but it also can help with point four, which is entertainment value beyond the game itself, which can be in the form of streaming or possibly in the form of TikTok. And now, why does this matter? Well, if you have a really engaged community, then you can benefit from community leveraged virality, where your community becomes your biggest ambassadors. They take to the streaming platforms, they take to TikTok, they take to other forms of social media, and they're really trying to drag players into your game for you. So again, the relationship between developer and community can't be overstated in most cases for these games. Now, again, I would also say Helldivers 2 has done a really great job of doing some very interesting things, working together with their community. If we had a little bit more time, we would dive deeper into that, but I would highly recommend folks go and look into things like Game Master Joel and look into some of the other activations they've done. And I will give them a shout out as well, where they've done an excellent job of players coming on TikTok, players coming on Twitter or other forms of social media and talking about the surprise drops that they're coming across, where they encounter a new enemy or maybe a new weapon or something like that while they're playing a game that was not announced as a part of a season's pass. And then the CEO of Arrowhead will actually come out and deny it and say that it's enemy propaganda, which I think is a really playful way for the community to engage, for the developer to engage with its community. And it also works really in-game with the universe as well. So again, I would highly encourage looking at Helldivers 2 as a case study. Now we move on to our final slide, and here we're going to try to answer the question, who are these players, and what are some of their kind of paying behaviors? So all of those titles that we looked at on the prior page, again, we found some common success factors through them, but we wanted to know, is it the same group of players that are playing all of these games? And what we did to answer that question was we used our payer overlap index. And what that means is we take a base game. In this case, we took the base game of Palworld, and we tried to understand what other games have people who have bought Palworld, what have they purchased? And we're able to see this because we have a receipts panel, so we can actually understand how players are spending their money and if someone who's purchased Palworld has actually purchased other titles. And what we found is that in the case of Ready or Not, there's as much as an 8 times the likelihood of an average player that a Palworld player will have purchased Ready or Not. And that goes up all the way to 16 times for Enshrouded. So again, that means that a base player of Palworld is 8 times more likely than an average player to have purchased Ready or Not, and up to 16 times more likely to have purchased Enshrouded. And if you look further down on the chart, you will see for Call of Duty, these Pal World players still do over-index. They're 3 times more likely, 2 times in the case of EA Sports, and about on par on average for Madden, and then maybe a little bit less likely for NBA 2K. But this is somewhat expected because Call of Duty, EAFC, and Madden, as we talked about in earlier slides, these are some of the biggest games of all time, and we're looking at payers. So we're looking at people who are spending money. So it doesn't surprise us that they over-index a bit in a title like EAFC or Call of Duty. What's surprising is how much they over-index in these other titles. So what this tells us is that there's absolutely a cohort of gamers out there that is moving from new hit to new hit. They're trend chasers. They're really interested in playing the latest and greatest games that are on the market. Most importantly, because we're looking at payer behavior, these people are willing to pay for these experiences. Now, on the flip side, it does appear that this is a somewhat fickle group of gamers where they will move from your game or one game to the next game relatively quickly. Now, of course, they spent money, which is good. They help to grow the organic sort of popularity or virality of the title, which is great. But they might not stay long term. So this begs a few questions. Is this group of gamers relevant for your game? If the answer is yes, how can you tap into them? How can you activate them to get them to come into your game, not only to drive revenue for it, but also to drive visibility and organic growth of user acquisition? But then as important is how will you retain this group of gamers? Can you even retain this group of gamers? And is that reflected in your forecasts for your title? Now, this is just one example of payer overlap. We can also do player overlap, and we can also use different base games to compare between. So again, I will refer back to the products we mentioned on the earlier screen. If you're a subscriber to our Game Performance Monitor, this is exactly the type of analysis that you can do within that tool. And with that, we have reached the end of this presentation. So in summary, we looked at areas of opportunity and we saw that pay-to-play live service and premium titles appear to be a winning strategy for new releases, or at least they have been in 2023. We took some learnings from recent successes like Baldur's Gate, Ready or Not, and so on and so forth. And we talked about attracting trend chasers and their willingness to pay, but also some of the concerns around whether or not they will stay with your game long term. And with that, I thank you for attending our presentation today. On the screen right now is a QR code that goes to my LinkedIn. So if you feel like getting in touch, please do. My email is also shown here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And finally, I will set I've got a second QR code on the screen here, which will take you to a website where you can download the free version of this report, which contains all the information that we just went through and more for you to review. So again, thank you very much for joining today, and best of luck on your new game launches in the future. Bye for now.